So first off, Rachel and Kenneth, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm just going to set my timer. There we go. I want to make sure we're on time. The presentation that myself and my colleague here, Kenneth, is going to be giving is a complete experiment. We don't know what Justice Scenographics are. We're here to ask you what you think we might be able to do to prepare for civilization change. We're going to offer a framework in which that could be discussed. Kenneth's going to talk about his particular practice that he's been doing now for a number of years in Boston and in the United States. But we don't know what Justice Scenographics are. This is an open question, but we do know that we need to prepare for civilization change. So Kenneth.
Hello, my name's Kenneth Bailey, and I'm from Boston, and I work at the Design Studio for Social Intervention, which is a social justice informed design studio. But more importantly, I'm Dorita Hanna's friend. And I guess the proposition I want to pose to this community here is, what could scenography or scenographic thinking, techniques and practices bring to bear for people like me who are concerned about social justice and making the world a better place? What might scenography bring to bear to help us practice and imagine new worlds? So one of the big projects that we've been working on since maybe about 4 or 5 years ago was called the Social Emergency Response Center. And it came out of a body of work that we started after the advent of a problem we're having in the United States around state-sanctioned violence. And that is primarily violence that's happening vis-a-vis the state through police and juridical forms of power, particularly with black and brown people. And one of the problems that we've been facing is not just the act of state-sanctioned violence, but and what it's doing to actual people and actual families, but also the horizontal effects of that violence, and that is the social distance that's being created in communities, and what I refer to as a productive absence of people who are not facing the problems, responses to the problems. And so what you start to have are pieces of division, mistrust, shame, and fracture amongst communities across lines of difference. And we think of that as the sort of affects of the social emergency. And we know that this is asymmetrically experienced and asymmetrically distributed. So, for example, the social emergency that's being experienced in Venezuela right now, or the one we just saw in Catalonia, is going to be different or have different sort of manifestations than the one we're talking about in the United States. However, we can all agree that they all are aiming towards this global sort of telos of civilizational collapse. And so everybody's saying in the newspapers that, you know, they're thinking we may have 50 years, maybe we may have 30 years, but we don't have very long in sort of a human historical epic to really figure out how we live otherwise. And so a lot of what we've been doing at the studio is trying to produce new strategies for new atmospheres. And that is produce ways to have us jump across the lines of fracture, difference, shame, and mistrust that are being animated through actions through the state, through actions through the market sector, to try to help us figure out how to practice new worlds, how to practice living otherwise. And projects like the Social Emergency Response Center, which was a project we did to help people from lines of difference come together and admit how they were feeling, in practice and in partnership with trying to figure out how to act together across problems that are being asymmetrically experienced. And other projects that I had a chance to work with Rita a lot on, called Public Kitchen, which we posed the question: if kitchens were public like schools or libraries, how would they change social life? How would they make life more convivial and more interesting? And how am I doing?
You're good, yeah, you're not halfway through yet.
Good. And so we're really, really interested in how to make life more interesting and more livable and more friendly and more relational and all of these good things. However, the practices of producing atmospheres is a particular practice that once I found out about performance design and scenography, I said, you guys have a lot that you could bring to bear on the kinds of work that we're trying to do, sort of bringing artists, activists, and academics together to solve intractable problems. And so I would pose again to this community, how might this community actually step into the world of helping design studios and civil society organizations in general solve social problems? To give you a small example, the first day I got here, I ordered way too much food. I didn't know I was in Prague. And I could barely eat half of it. And I don't have a place to take the food that I ordered, but there wasn't any affordances for me to properly share the food that I had ordered. And I thought, this is a small problem, but how might an intervention, how might some sort of new spatial relations, how might some new spatial organizations make it possible for that food to move back into an ecosystem without othering or saying you need something, but in a way that actually was convivial and might actually shape or reanimate new categories of ways of being together, ones that don't sort of reify that I'm a consumer and you're a producer, or I have and you don't. And that's a very small problem, but I think, scenography could potentially come up with practices to solve it. And then, problems expand from there to the larger problem of civilizational collapse, where we might have 50 years to get it right. And so what might scenographic thinking, techniques and practices bring to bear to allow people for whom facing this looming problem is impossible to face, or for whom stepping into a new world seems daunting and unacceptable. And so I'm going to leave that challenge to this community to say, we need you, and we would really love to be thinking with you in terms of how we might build new strategies for new atmospheres, particularly in line of helping us all globally come to terms and live new now in the face of civilizational collapse. And I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay. I think you're the first person on the Wall of Fame. You finished early, so that's, that's good. Okay. So scenographics. I'm not going to spend too long on scenographics. I'm going to spend more time on theory of civilization change and a particular theorist called Arturo Escobar, who accidentally finds out that you knew. And I read Arturo's latest book, which I mention in a moment, on the plane to go and see Kenny in Boston. And I went and read this book and realized that the thing I was going to do with you in Boston had now completely changed because I had read Arturo's book. But then you said, oh yeah, we know him. He's kind of doing the foreword for the book that we're contributing to. And I was like, oh, brilliant. All of these things kind of coalesce in such interesting ways. But scenographics.
We have a book out too, I'll tell you about it later. It's called Ideas, Arrangements, Effects. It's going to be out in the winter. Look for it.
Boom. So I've written a book called Beyond Scenography, and the key legacy questions out of that book was, what does scenography do? How does it affect, orientate, and shape staged atmospheres? The key question I have always tended to be asked when I was writing the book was, what is beyond scenography? It's not necessarily an answer, but some of this. Scenographics as a plural, so in the same way that something can be theatre and theatrical, the same way it can be performance and performative, the same way it can be choreography and choreographic, dramaturgy and dramaturgical, it can be scenography and scenographic. However, I use the idea of scenographics to resist the idea of the scenographic as definitive and monolithic, and rather kind of think about how scenographics are always an assemblage of affects coming together which shape and orientate how we experience place with ideas of world, with ideas of atmospheres. Scenographics are always plural in their encounter. They are never a singular, pure medium of light, sound, costume and set design as four established methodologies of doing scenography, the scenography family. This idea of world is something that I've become relatively obsessed by, and particularly in terms of thinking about how scenographics might offer a particular practice, a methodology, and a perspective lens for critiquing established orthodoxies of world as concept, but also world as practice. Here's some of the key kind of words that, in terms of my legacy thinking, some of them feature within Beyond Scenography, but not all exclusively. They're all there, but not. Othering is the key one that I dwell upon, but there are other kind of ideas going on there. But as I see, this idea of a mesh, the idea of relations, the idea of an assemblage, the idea of atmosphere, these are things that I see as being integral to scenographics, however they might be manifested. So here's, me quoting myself. What I'm just going to do is just highlight the key words of, let's just do it. Let's go. So interventional acts of orientation that complicate, reveal, or score processes of worlding as a process, not as something that is passive, but as something that is ongoing. Boom, boom, boom. So scenographics, they score how worlds are conceptualized as effective atmospheres. So ideas of effective atmospheres have been written by a cultural geographer called Ben Anderson, who works at the University of Durham. He's absolutely fascinating. The idea of atmosphere in geography is a super sexy subject, and I really geographers are doing the sorts of things that we are also doing, but they talk about it in different ways. And that cross-disciplinary conversations are hugely important. So spatial justice, scenographics, let's kind of try and think about what this middle bit might mean. Spatial justice is something that Kenny in the studio have been working as a framework. A geographer called Edward Sojaya, he's kind of introduced the idea of spatial justice, particularly in terms of policy planning within industrial places within, or particularly in LA, in the United States, and thinking about how justice is spatial. And how we might redesign things like bus routes, redesign things like our energy infrastructure to ensure that things are fair and just, rather than privileging those who have money. So ideas of civilization change. I'm good. Civilization change. So one of the key frameworks that I'm particularly interested in is an economics person, I can't say it for some reason, economics person who works at the University of Oxford, and she's called Kate Rayworth. She has a very affordable book that's written for the general audience called Donut Economics. So she effectively argues how the growth model of the 20th century was not only never sustainable, but it is now deeply damaging to our own ability to thrive. The growth model is always articulated within economics as an upward going curve. It's something that we know. So she's very interested in shape and form. So 20th century economics looks like this. And it just goes on forever. We've all seen those graphs. That's what 20th century economics looks like. And Kate Raworth sat down in 2013 and she asked herself, what shape might economics have if it wasn't an upward curve? And she drew two concentric circles, one in the middle and one on the outside. She drew a donut and she said, how might I conceptualize economics in terms of a donut? And she says that the inner circle is a social foundation. What is it that we as humans need to ensure that we can thrive, but also have a just and equal society? Actually, equal, that's not the key word, it's about just. It's about being just. That's the kind of internal framework. And then you have an external framework, which is the climate ceiling. What is it that the resources of our world and the long-term longevity of our world can afford us to live like? So I'm halfway through. Can afford us to live like. And then she offers this idea that a regenerative and distributive economy, the safe and just space for humanity, exists in this Goldilocks zone between the social foundation and the climate ceiling. You can then see she introduces a whole range of factors which might influence how we model that. And the idea, she has lots of brilliant diagrams basically on the internet where she basically imagines, like, so if you push this one kind of down, how would that affect some of the things in the middle? And if you push kind of biodiversity up, or biodiversity loss up, how would that increase kind of other things? So she's very interested in looking at ideas of balance and the relationship between political systems and what is it that our world has the resource to achieve. Okay, so as promised, this is Arturo Escobar's more recent book, The Designs for the Pluriverse, Radical Interdependence, Autonomy, and the Making of Worlds. So Arturo Escobar is an anthropologist, mainly now based in America, but most of his work is based on Colombian culture and the ideas of the Global South. So the Global South as a particular movement to kind of rethink how the Global North has dominated philosophy and the ways in which we think about world. And so Arturo Escobar's idea of the pluriverse, quite kind of simply, you've heard of the universe as uni. Here's an idea of pluriverse as multiple. Another way of thinking about how we can imagine future, and another way of thinking about how we can practice interdependency and interrelationships with one another, both globally but also radically locally. So here is an image of a recent film called The Valerian by the French filmmaker Luc Besson, where the whole premise of this movie is that they build a space station, actually using the current space station, the International Space Station. It starts off the International Space Station, then over a series of decades, they keep adding to it, and then this basically city-state, which is out in space, grows so big that it needs to leave Earth's gravity and go off into the universe. Now, why I'm fascinated by this is that the ideas of globalization and the ideas of unity as a national global product are kind of conceptualized in this kind of idea of a very distant future, which is kind of half mythology, half actual political ideology, where our own technology will allow us to exceed the material qualities of the world in which has birthed us. Arturo Escobar says that this is impossible. And this future of us going and basically globalizing the universe by traveling around is something that ultimately will damage our own ability to thrive. This is not our future. This is a useful speculative design technique, but it is not our future. In trying to achieve this kind of future, we will exhaust our own resources and render ourselves extinct. This is something that we need to shift in terms of what he describes as our techno-capitalist imaginary. We need to have another kind of imaginary, which isn't necessarily, I mean, it's not a rejection of technology or anything like that. I'm a big sci-fi geek. I love all this sort of stuff. But the ways in which we imagine can be very driven to a particular kind of terminal velocity where humans leave the Earth and go elsewhere, and this will save us. This idea that our own ingenuity will save us from our own inability to use the resources. We will be like locusts, moving from one planet to the next planet to kind of ensure that we survive because somehow and for some reason we deserve it more than others. This is an impossibility, but also something that is deeply problematic. So Arturo Escobar offers a number of kind of ideas, but the key thing that I want to just dwell upon is this kind of last bit here. So it says, new media for the pluriverse. And he doesn't really talk too much about what he means by new media for the pluriverse, but he does give a little outline where he says, I'm going to highlight the key words here again. So the pluriverse studies and transition design actually is the key thing that he talks about, ideas of transition design. How do we go from our current ontologies and our current ways of living to other ways of living, which are in themselves practical? I'm very interested in how we might kind of circumvent some of those initial issues and think more about the long-term imaginary and how we might speculate very long-distant ideas of terminal humanity and how that might inform local decision-making. So transition to our new media and communication strategies. This idea that the pluriversal communication strategies would serve two main purposes. One, to construct narratives that persuade people into thinking about why the one world story. So the idea of the pluriverse is this idea that there are multiple worlds, multiple ways of living, and that Arturo Escobar argues that colonialism enforced a one world view, which is in itself destructive. And this is the kind of techno-capitalist mythology that infects our cultures, infects the ways in which we live our world. And this idea of the world, as opposed to worlds, is something to be critiqued. And then the idea is to contribute to make visible the projects by which other practices attempt to preserve and perform themselves into worlds. He's basically talking about colonialism there, that the ways in which colonialism attempts to preserve and perform itself into world, as opposed to the material kind of constructs and the mesh that we live with. So the key tasks that we have to set ourselves are to speculate new ways of imagining world that reject the human nature divide. Humans are as natural as anything else. Embraces an ecological ceiling of economics, considers radical localism as viable. I haven't spoken too much about that, but it's kind of in the title. Invites a new imagination in preparation for civilization change. And then I've got 1 minute left, so I tend to give at the end of my presentations now the manifesto that features within my book in terms of the broader context of scenographics. But I think they allow you to read between the lines in the way that Kenny just invited you all to think about how the practices that you're all doing can contribute and help us reimagine our relationship to world. Because if scenography is anything, it's about the way in which we imagine world. And this is crucial in terms of our ability to thrive in the future, both as humanity, but also humanity as being more than human, as being with world in a not necessarily sustainable, but in a balanced and thriveful way. So here we go. Are you irritated? I won't say them actually. Thank you very much.